Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Weather History. Today we're going to be talking about Hurricane Katrina, the most famous hurricane, at least in America. Before we do get into this video though, this is proudly sponsored by Flight Glass and Window. Check them out in the link below. So, first of all, what was Hurricane Katrina? That's a good question. Hurricane Katrina was a devastating hurricane that hit the southeastern part of Louisiana and just devastated New Orleans, one of the biggest cities in Louisiana. And the hurricane, a lot of people know it as the massive Category 5. You've probably seen the pictures of it in the Gulf of Mexico. But actually, when it did make landfall in Louisiana, it only did so as a Category 3 hurricane. Actually, at the particular location that you can see the Category 3 hurricane symbol. So it really wasn't actually that strong compared to how strong it had been at one point in its life. So things could have been much worse. So let's get into as it happened. So first it all starts with Tropical Depression 10 in the central Atlantic. Tropical Depression 10 would form relatively quickly before getting ripped to shreds by the Atlantic and not developing at all. But Tropical Depression 10 would continue to go along as remnants of itself and would become Tropical Depression 12. Tropical Depression 12 would form and would actually form into something that would become very significant, as we all know. Tropical Depression 12's first advisory would be issued by the National Hurricane Center, giving tropical storm warnings for all of the Bahamas and showing a path of a tropical storm hitting Florida before it becomes a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. The storm would continue along with winds of 35 miles per hour, still having all the tropical storm warnings prompted in the Bahamas, but now also showing a tropical storm watch in Florida. The storm would continue on, still keeping all the watches and warnings. Now, still Tropical Depression 12, expected to become a tropical storm any minute now, with tracks not really changing too much. Still expected to become a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Tropical Depression 12 would get its act together and would become Tropical Storm Katrina. Little did people know it would become one of the most significant storms in U.S. history. It was then expected that the tropical storm would continue along and become a hurricane as it hit the Florida coast. Still having tropical storm warnings throughout all the Bahamas, now we had a tropical storm warning throughout all the Florida coast, with the Florida Keys now having a tropical storm watch. Within the tropical storm warning on the Florida coast, there was a hurricane watch surrounding that tropical storm warning. Now with winds of 40 miles per hour, Tropical Storm Katrina was starting to get her act together. Now you'll notice winds of 45 miles per hour tropical storm warnings now have been put off of the southern Bahamas, and now you do see tropical storm warnings surrounded with hurricane watches inland in Florida. You can also see the track of the hurricane now expected to hit the Panhandle as a Category 2 system, with winds of 45 miles per hour. The storm would now strengthen with winds of 50 miles per hour, still having the tropical storm warnings in the Bahamas, and now also having hurricane warnings for all the places with hurricane watches and tropical storm warnings before. Now with the tropical storm watch throughout the Florida Keys and a tropical storm watch up north of where the hurricane warning is. Now the storm was well expected to weaken to a tropical storm after it went inland and then hit the Florida coast, weakening to a tropical depression rather quickly. New Orleans, not even in the cone of uncertainty. Then the cone would continue to shift, even seeing that Katrina could go along the eastern seaboard. Now with winds of 50 miles per hour, Tropical Storm Katrina was starting to show her wrath on Florida, which had hurricane warnings in effect. Now with the tropical storm watch throughout also the southwestern coast of Florida. They would continue to see Tropical Storm Katrina strengthen, now with winds of 60 miles per hour expected to become a hurricane within the next advisory. So with Tropical Storm warning still in a little bit of the Bahamas and a hurricane warning in effect, the storm would expect to go through Florida, weaken to a tropical storm, and then become a hurricane again in the Atlantic, only becoming a Category 1 before hitting the Florida Panhandle. Then Katrina did exactly as expected, becoming a Category 1 hurricane right before hitting Florida. Then the hurricane warning would be shrunk some, although you would still see the hurricane warning for the lake in Florida. You also see it throughout part of the East Coast. It hit Miami directly. Tropical storm warnings now on the southwestern coast and the Florida Keys as well. This is the actual track of the storm, though, so you'll notice that even though the storm was expected to go out and along this way, it really just didn't do as expected and actually went well outside of the cone of uncertainty for its landfall. Now, with winds of 75 miles per hour, Category 1 Hurricane Katrina was showing herself. So let's see what they thought would happen. So it did really exactly as expected. It did go a little farther south than the center of the cone of uncertainty, but still was within the cone of uncertainty, as the storm did make landfall in Florida, hitting Miami nearly directly, actually impacting Fort Lauderdale a little worse. But even so, the direct landfall in between Fort Lauderdale and Miami did occur. It would go straight through, but this is where things didn't go quite right. It maintained its hurricane intensity as it continued to head south, while they thought it would weaken to a tropical storm. Then what they thought would happen was it would go up the Florida coast, and then it would make landfall, kind of like this. This is actually radar of Hurricane Hermine, but I think it represents fairly well what they thought Katrina would do. So let's go on to the next advisory. Still hurricane warnings in effect, winds of 75 miles per hour with the storm, causing tropical storm conditions for the Florida Keys and western Florida. The storm would continue to go along now with New Orleans back in the cone, and you can see it starting to shift. Winds are still of 75 miles per hour, as it's now expected to become a Category 3 hurricane. The storm would continue to strengthen, now with winds of 80 miles per hour, starting to really begin to strengthen. The storm is really starting to get its act together, but still is expected to hit the Florida Panhandle or the Mississippi or Alabama coast, although not as strong as initially what happened. Then the storm would rapidly intensify to the point that despite not really moving, the Hurricane Center didn't even update their forecast track. It intensified so rapidly they decided to put another update, now with the storm having maximum sustained winds of 100 miles per hour. Now Hurricane Katrina was a Category 2. Katrina would continue along Katrina right around here at this point, going into a very warm loop of water known as a pool loop within the Gulf of Mexico. This would be what would cause such rapid intensification for Hurricane Katrina. Katrina, still having winds of 100 miles per hour, would continue to go out and along, now with the Hurricane Center beginning to realize what's going to happen, now forecasting a major hurricane to head towards New Orleans. The storm would continue to intensify, now with winds of 105 miles per hour, New Orleans in its sights. Then Katrina would do what was really expected and become a Category 3 hurricane. The storm would now have winds of 115 miles per hour, which could level buildings if sustained for long enough. The storm was now what is known as a major hurricane. All storms Category 3 or above are known as major hurricanes. The storm would continue along, and it's actually at around the same intensity that it would be when it did hit New Orleans as a Category 3 on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. It would continue to strengthen, still with winds of 115 miles per hour. It now prompted a hurricane watch for the New Orleans and eastern Louisiana coast. This is becoming a very sad situation. High surf would begin around New Orleans, and it wasn't looking very good for them. The storm would still maintain its intensity, but the hurricane watch would widen some, and then it would become a hurricane warning. The hurricane warning would now be in effect for all of the eastern Louisiana coast and the Mississippi and Alabama coasts. Still with winds of 115 miles per hour, Katrina was struggling to intensify. But then, Katrina would defy all odds and become a Category 4. Despite its struggle to intensify because of an eye wall replacement cycle, it would suddenly begin to rapidly intensify, becoming a Category 4 hurricane with winds of 145 miles per hour. This is about a 30 mile per hour intensification in less than 6 hours. This was bad news for New Orleans, and now we were continuing to see it intensify as the cone of uncertainty continued to narrow. The storm would maintain its 145 mile per hour intensity and would now prompt tropical storm warnings throughout all of the western Louisiana coast and the eastern Florida panhandle. I'm at the western Florida panhandle. Then Katrina would become the most intense hurricane category of all, Category 5, with winds of 160 miles per hour. The storm would continue to head up and would continue to start to wreak havoc on New Orleans. The storm would then continue to intensify as a Category 5, now with winds of 175 miles per hour, the most intense Hurricane Katrina would ever get. Katrina would then begin to weaken because of land interaction and colder waters, and you could see now winds of 165 miles per hour. Still a Category 5, though, on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. The hurricane warning still the same, with the tropical storm warnings and hurricane watches also the same. Here it is as it approaches New Orleans. Still a Category 5 on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. Then, Hurricane Katrina would weaken now to the bare minimum wind speed of a Category 5 hurricane, with only winds of 160 miles per hour. And I guess I shouldn't be saying only, those are very intense winds, starting to bring serious Category 2 impacts to Louisiana. The storm would then make its first landfall with winds of 150 miles per hour on the coast. But this was very bad, especially at the angle the hurricane was coming in at. Here's why. So you can probably see the Category 4, that is Hurricane Katrina at this point, as it does make landfall. And you can also see this radar imagery also showing the landfall that Hurricane Katrina would make. Very devastating. But you'll probably notice that the storm, as all hurricanes do, is turning counterclockwise. That's a bad thing, because since storms rotate counterclockwise, that means that since you see where New Orleans is and it's actually below sea level, all this water is getting pushed in by the storm because of its counterclockwise rotation, and that will cause levees to fail and devastation throughout New Orleans, causing many homes to be flooded and many people to lose their homes and lives. Here's the storm now making its final landfall with winds of 125 miles per hour. It was a devastating storm and would continue to head up and still wreak havoc throughout New Orleans. Actually now no longer pushing waters but bringing waters away and actually bringing them now south into New Orleans, which makes things even worse. This, courtesy of UltimateChase.com, is a animation of what exactly occurred within Katrina. Here's another one showing a tornado that ripped through New Orleans from Hurricane Katrina. And here's the aftermath of what Katrina did. You won't see too many homes leveled or destroyed. You'll see a few, but you'll see most of them flooded. That is the problem here. Most of the time, hurricanes don't destroy homes, and when they do, it's pretty bad, but you'll see them flood them, which I guess is a form of destruction, but you don't normally see the winds destroying homes much. And here we are just continuing to look at what Hurricane Katrina did. Here's radar imagery of how Katrina made landfall and all the storms it produced. And you can actually see it head up and see what it did, actually impacting close to our home area of St. Louis, impacting the southern viewing area. So I guess that's an interesting fact that we did get some rain from Hurricane Katrina as it did head up north. Check me out on social media at Microcasting on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you so much for watching. This is Microcasting St. Louis, signing out.